Nothing on the Bonnell Foundation's Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bonnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Viatris, Genentech, and Vertex. Here's your host, Laura Bonnell.
51-year-old Rory Tallon works with Cystic Fibrosis Ireland as a CF patient advocate as part of CFI's member service team. Rory has cystic fibrosis and was recently featured in another podcast that we did about nonprofit and about that nonprofit that he's involved in. But in this podcast, he's talking about dating someone with CF. It happens between more people than you may know, and he tells us why and tells us about his former girlfriend, Jean. Rory is now married to Sarah, and they have 2 daughters. But we decided to talk about this aspect of Rory's life because his relationship with Jean did last for 9 years, and it's something that the CF community does deal with. So it was important to raise awareness that people with CF do, in some cases, date other people with cystic fibrosis. And Rory, welcome back. We thoroughly enjoyed having you on the podcast recently, and equally delighted to have you back here to talk about your CF dating story. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I think it is a little bit more common than people think. And I just wanted you to talk about kind of why you decided, both of you had decided to date someone else who had cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, well, it wasn't necessarily an active choice at the time, if you know what I mean. Like, so I met Jean in 1995. It was a Christmas party, and just from speaking to her, we had a lot in common. She was in her final year studying science degree. I had already qualified with a science degree. I was working in the industry. And then, we just clicked, and yeah, CF was a big thing on our minds, but it was just the personal connection was amazing, and we just clicked. So it's because I met her that we just got involved in the relationship. And even though very early on in the relationship, we used to joke, say, right, I can't see anymore. This is it, but that never happened. We just, we ended up being a long-term couple, and yeah, it was a bit awkward because we both attended the same hospital. So the staff knew us and they knew we were a couple and all that. So, and for a little while, it was sort of an embarrassment to me that I was in that situation. But at the end of the day, you're 2 human beings. And at the time that I met her, the cross-infection prevention wasn't as regimented as it is now. It was sort of, It was just coming down the tracks at that stage, but like the same thing might not happen now if it was to relive it, in the current knowledge of cross-infection. But it did, and we were a couple and we lived together. We, lived in an apartment together, and we were 9 years together, so yeah, we just clicked.
I mean, you have such a small population of people with CF in Ireland that it is interesting that with such a small population that you would run into each other. But I say that knowing that in such a huge population, I did run into my husband. And so we had 2 kids with CF.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess small or large, it doesn't matter. It just happens, right?
Yeah. So we bumped into each other, and that was it then from when we bumped into each other, so.
You're 51 now, but then you would have been...
I was about 26 or something like that.
Yeah, so what did your parents think? What did her parents think? What did your parents think?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were probably going a little while before either sets of parents met us, but I mean, they just had accepted it. I suppose they didn't have a choice because that was their decision. They're probably live, let live type parents, both of them really. They didn't try to intervene or direct us otherwise. They just sort of accepted if that was our decision, that was our decision,
Yeah, and I think for anyone else, or any other disease, like if it was cancer or if it was MS or anything else, really, people wouldn't think of it as that big of a deal, I think.
Exactly.
I think because this is a respiratory disease and there's cross-contamination, I think that's probably why people think, oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
But, I've talked to multiple people now who've had relationships with other people with cystic fibrosis. And then I also think my girls have lived together their entire lives. I mean, they're not at this moment, but I know it's different, but still, it isn't that uncommon, right?
Yeah. I mean, from a microbiology perspective, we both were, I suppose, in the same cohorts of bacterial colonization, so it wasn't that we were both coming to it with extremely different sets of microbiology,
Mm-hmm.
So we were aware of that much at the time. And we were lucky, so we didn't have any of the more virulent versions of colonization, so we were lucky in that respect. So, had one of us acquired MRSA or something, I don't know where it would have gone if that was the case, but so more or less when we were living together, we both sort of were colonized by the same colonies or the same bacterial species, And then, of course, there's the individual variability in terms of disease progression and so on. But, sort of different bacterial pathogens weren't an issue because we had sort of common, bacterial profile.
Mm-hmm.
So after a while, we're almost a unit in terms of the cross-infection issue. Almost wasn't an issue anymore because we had the same sort of bacterial mix-up, if you like.
Gotcha.
I suppose what would be an issue then is the antibiotic resistances of the bacteria involved. But, I suppose we didn't worry. Well, we were a couple at that stage, so it was more or less whatever happens.
Right.
So that's the way. We didn't actively manage or discuss it as such, but that's more or less the way we operated,
There's a lot to learn over 9 years of a relationship. Other people that I've talked to who are dating or are married and have CF say that the other one gets it because you're dealing with the same thing. So kind of what happened over your 9 years?
Oh, well, I mean, from the very start, we both just instantly knew each other, in terms of our experiences and our mindsets and expectations and your ability as well to function within society. It is, as much as you don't want to admit, but it is, I won't say it's curtailed by CF, but it is impacted by CF. You have to work with it, so you can do all you want to do, but you have to work with it, so you're not as free as other people who don't have CF to go off and live very active social life, or even though people with CF probably do that, but you have to factor your CF in that while you're doing that. But we both sort of just inherently knew that without even have to have direct conversations around it. So if Jean wanted to go out, fine. If she didn't want to go out, fine. Same with me, and I won't say we didn't go out, but we wouldn't have lived the same intense social life that peers at that young age in your mid-late 20s would do,
Right.
But, and that's mainly because of CF. But we were working as well. She was studying and then after her first degree, she went on to do a master's degree. So she was still studying for another year or two, just life and work and trying to manage that with CF as well, and with all your hospital appointments and all that. So it is tough. Anyone with CF, managing life and CF, you don't have the same amount of time to do the leisurely things that people who don't have CF do,
Right.
in a day or in a weekend or in a week or on a holiday or, so, but we knew that and we understood that of each other. So we didn't have frustrating expectations one versus the other, that maybe someone in a relationship with someone who doesn't have CF, that the partners, they might understand and you might discuss it and explain it, but isn't that just, it's a very learned experience, a very learned understanding. And there's probably a lot of frustration once you get a point that you do understand that completely, whereas myself and Jean just understood all that from the start, without having to have to justify it to each other or anything, so we just got a lot of things together that probably takes a long while for a non-CF person in a relationship to get from the person with CF.
Yeah. And were you both studying similar?
Well, I was working at the time when I met her, but so I had finished. I was 2-3 years older than her. So she was still qualifying in science. She was doing environmental science. I did microbiology actually in college. Yeah.
So you had a lot to talk about though. A lot of
just commonality actually in CF. Yeah. And well, yeah, science and careers. Yeah, was interesting. And ultimately she ended up working in a really interesting area doing, because she couldn't do field work in environmental science because of her physical disease progression by the time she'd qualified. But she worked in remote sensing, satellite imagery, and she really loved that, within that sphere of environmental science. So we had great conversations about her work and what she was up to. And, at that stage I was in an industry that was actually pharmaceutical industry in terms of the data management side of drug trials. So my job was nowhere near as interesting as hers.
Well, and then I would think it's hard too, because, and people I've talked to on the podcast, if you're the caregiver and you don't have CF or you're the healthy one, it's always hard. But then in your case, are you both the caregivers, or was there always one, you were always healthier, or how did that dynamic work?
Yeah, I suppose the dynamic, I was always healthier. I was more fortunate than she was, and I was playing active team sports, almost to the end of our relationship. So I was healthy and I was getting on with things. And so I would do a lot of the caring duties as such. No, she was quite independent up until the last maybe 3-4 years of her life. Then she became that bit more dependent, and we didn't have direct family support in our locality, in our facility. Mm-hmm. So it was really just ourselves to rely on each other. But I mean, the worst time I remember was I got a very bad pneumonia one year and I had to go into hospital. And she also had an infection, but she wouldn't go into hospital because we had 2 cats. She didn't want to leave them. Mm-hmm. And I got out the weekends, they let me out the weekends, but I was still on therapy. And I got a taxi straight back. I had to go do the shopping, clean up the flat, all that sort of stuff that she was unable to do, out the bins, all that, and then back into hospital.
Wow.
To report back in for duty. So that was 2-3 weeks of that. So that was the worst experience I remember. But luckily for me, I was, apart from winter flus and colds, I was only admitted for IVs once or twice during that period of our relationship together. So mostly I was the caregiver basically when she became dependent,
And at some point, even though what you just talked about, obviously you can't stop thinking about cystic fibrosis, but at some point, were you able to and just, went about your relationship and your work? And
yeah, to us, it was an integral part of our life, and it wasn't that we were saturated with it or anything. It was just part of our life. And Jean was heavily involved with CF Ireland as a volunteer at that stage, and she used to produce a patient magazine, and I sort of got involved in that to help her out a bit as well. And, we worked in harmony together on that. It was quite, some of the parts were better than the individual components, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So we worked really well on that. And so, in terms of just leisure time and relaxation, we'd interchange topics around what we were doing for the magazine, what she was doing for CF Ireland, the work, her volunteer work, and then instantly maybe just switch over to non-CF related life issues or topics, and that just switched. It wasn't like we had to physically switch it off or actively switch it off. It was just always there. If we talked about it, we talked about it. It didn't swamp us or anything, we were just, it was just part of us, and we were happy out if we talked about it or didn't talk about it, so it wasn't an issue for us.
And I think too, now almost, I know you said we know more about cross-contamination and bacteria, but we also have better CF modulators. So
yeah,
people are healthier. So when it happens with people, maybe it's not, doesn't come across so shocking or something.
Yeah, that would be my aspiration for these modulators, that you get to a sense that people with CF are treated like humans again, because you're treated very clinically and coldly in terms of cross-infection management from the clinical hospital perspective. And there's an expectation of that out into the real world outside of the hospital environment, but that's not easy to do. And it goes against some human nature and human side of your person to not want to meet others with sort of the same condition as you in terms of solidarity and speaking together and working together and even meeting each other and even developing friendships and so on. So down the line, hopefully, with years of these modulator therapies, maybe, and that's my hope, that cross-infection won't be an issue and that people with CF can be human again to other people with CF, if you know what I mean.
Right. Be in the same room and not be concerned.
Yeah.
It's such a concern right now. Even when you go to clinic, at least in the United States, they have you waiting in the hallway or something. You're not sitting in a waiting room all
Absolutely,
together,
yeah.
right? So it would take away the isolation of the disease.
Completely, yeah. The cross-infection management now does add an awful lot of isolation, in addition to anyone with advanced illness who has isolation enforced on them from reduced mobility and a reduced ability to get out of the house or to, actively engage in society. That is very isolating, but the cross-infection management makes it a lot more isolating. Since I met Jean, like that's a generation ago, 2 generations ago, maybe even, internet, social media, everything has come on leaps and bounds since then. So people with CF have established networks, social media networks, remote networks, and maybe good friendships through that. But that poor second best to having friends with CF that you can meet in person, or having a human friend that you can meet in person, CF or not CF. But the fact that 2 people with CF can't meet in person, or there's a guidance against that as such, just takes a little bit of your human choice away, so that very much would be my hope. If the modulators can bring that about, I would see them as being truly successful,
Yeah. And looking back, so as parents, we couldn't have play dates with our CF kids. And that was really a bummer.
Exactly, yeah.
And then we had friends who had a cottage and everybody from the school would go, but we couldn't go because there was another child on the island with CF.
Yeah.
And that was really hard when the kids were young, trying to help them to understand.
Completely, yeah.
So things like that, yeah, it would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Right.
But then you've 2 daughters with CF and they've lived their lives together in the same confined spaces and everything, so how do they see each other's CF in terms of cross-infection to each other, and, they've probably had each other in terms of a solidarity support or CF to CF, they probably appreciate that they had that, whereas some people that don't have a sibling with CF, that have never known or met another human being in person that has CF.
Right.
That is very isolating. It is very isolating.
It is. So tell us about Jean and tell us about her CF journey and then how everything went with her and your relationship.
Well, I mean, when I first met her, I knew that her level of disease progression was a lot greater than mine. But as I said, we clicked. But even from when I met her, her physical ability was quite restricted compared to mine. So we didn't do anything too taxing in terms of events together. We did plenty of social trips and relaxing things, but she wasn't able for very strenuous physical activity, in terms of mountain hikes or things like that. We weren't out on the mountains every week or something like some active couples might be, or, we did enjoy getting out to parks for walks, gentle walks and things like that, or to the beach for a splash in the sea or something, So it was very gentle activities, but, we did everything else you do together. We went on holidays, all that stuff, And it was like that for about the first 6-7 years. And now within that time, there was hospitalization. So Jean was frequently hospitalized, very typical hospitalization frequency, 1-2 times a year, sometimes more frequent, and managing all that. But, we did that and got back to living our lives as best we could. But, as her disease progressed, towards the last 3-4 years of our relationship, she'd been on the lung transplant list. And, more frequent hospitalizations, oxygen dependent, back in the apartment. And then leaving the house was an issue because at that stage you didn't have portable oxygen concentrators. So she was just on little portable tanks that had a very limited time span. So you could only go so far from your house, So managing all that and just visiting family and friends, that's sort of the extent of the life we lived. But her disease progressed then, and so she was on the transplant list about 2 years, and she got one call. So she was in hospital at the time. It was the middle of the night. My phone was ringing and I was completely unconscious asleep and managed to answer it. And I thought it just rang, but they'd been ringing 3 or 4 times apparently. And so I rang the hospital that Jean was in at the moment, and she was in the accident emergency. So, we didn't have a dedicated unit, with dedicated beds for CF at that stage. So she was in accident emergency, and so the transplant unit. So at that stage, the transplant unit in Ireland was just getting set up. So at that stage, we had an agreement with the UK. The transplants were done in the UK. So she was attending Newcastle in the UK transplant centre. So that was who called, and I put them through then to St. Vincent's, where she was in accident emergency. And between the doctors and the transplant team, it was deemed that she wasn't well enough at that point in time, so that she didn't get to go for that transplant call. And then she never got another transplant call. So she died March 2007.
Wow.
So she was only 31 when she died. So, it was tough. So that was about 9 years to get her.
Yeah.
Like, I always knew her disease was far more progressed than mine. Her ability was a lot, she had mobility restrictions. I didn't. But I suppose in our minds, or certainly in my mind, and whether that I was naive or looking back, maybe I was naive, but it was probably a good place to be. I fully believed that she would get a transplant. I fully believed that we'd have continued time together, but the statistics, when you look back, and the reality of it, when you look back, was that there was only ever going to be less than 50-50 chance of being called for a transplant. But I suppose if I wasn't in that sort of positive state of mind, then maybe the day-to-day functionality would have just suffered really badly. So we got on with things, and I got on with going to work and things and supporting her when I had to, when she was in hospital, but I suppose if I wasn't of the mindset that I believed that she would get a transplant, then I don't know how I might have continued functioning day to day and going to work day to day, because, when you look back and think, how did I do that? I think it was only because I did fully believe that she would get the transplant,
I would imagine not only is it hard to go on because you've lost, someone you've been with for 9 years, but also it's not that you were looking at your future, but you're looking at the reality of cystic fibrosis that you have.
Yeah.
So I don't know, was it doubly hard, or were you more understanding of, like, how were you feeling when this happened?
Well, I mean, naturally, natural process of grief and all that brings, and devastation and loss. In terms of my own CF, though, I knew I was healthier with CF than Jean had been, and I knew, okay, there will be inevitably disease progression, but I was at a good point. Like, my health was still good, if you know what I mean. Considering that I had CF, it was still relatively stable. So I was, of course, lost. My partners just died, and I didn't know where to go. So, I just reassessed myself, and I said, okay, I'm at this age now, and do I live a life alone now, or do I put myself out there, go again, try again, see what happens? So that's what I did. And within a short period of time, very lucky to meet my current wife now, Sarah. Met later that same year, actually, was when I first met Sarah. So I was very lucky, but I made the active decision within 2, 3, 4 months of Jean passing that, okay, I've done my sadness bit. It's not that grief was complete. It was always there with you. But I made the active decision that I always miss Jean, but I made the decision that live my life alone, always missing her, isn't a good way to live my life. And if I wanted to do something, I had to actively do something about it. So I did set about actively doing something about it, So it was a tough decision. And then it was tough when I did meet Sarah, because then you're explaining your whole history, and you're trying not to saturate or, the conversations around your previous partner, while establishing a new relationship. But it was so integral to explaining my own CF. And then you're trying to explain that, well, it's not necessarily going to be the same for me. Right. As immediately as that, at least, you're trying to explain all this and hoping that your partner understands that or can rationalize that, So Sarah's been great as well. And it didn't seem to be too much of an issue to her. You never know what's going on completely inside someone's head, you know what I mean? So that's my understanding of how Sarah was around it. But obviously she must have anxieties that she doesn't share with me necessarily, but she's been great. And we've had, I've been married now over 10 years this stage, so, and we've 2 young children together, and that would never have happened if I hadn't have actively made a decision to do something about how do I want to live my life again, so.
Right.
I have to say I was all very fortunate, very lucky. I'd gone for years before I met Jean without having met anyone. But, I think is that I was a bit reluctant to open myself to anyone. Obviously bumped into loads of people that I might have been interested in, but I never necessarily pursued anything because I don't think I was ready to, or felt confident enough in myself, I suppose, to let someone else into my world of CF and having to explain that to someone, so I went through all my college years without being in relationships, when there was plenty of people that I would have liked to have, established relationships with. But, so that's not easy to let yourself open up to letting somebody else into your life,
Right.
into sharing your CF. You have to get yourself to a state of mind that say, yeah, I can do this, whereas a lot of time, the default was, no, I can't do this,
Right. And our lives are such a journey. Like everything that happens to us is so important and gets us where we are today. I think it's the same thing that I say and many other CF parents say. It's weird to say to some people, but CF has been a blessing because we have this beautiful CF community.
Mm.
We all get it. We appreciate life more, I feel.
I think so.
So there are blessings to it. Of course, we don't wish it on anyone, this genetic disease, and we want a cure and all of that. But it is a journey, and your story is going to help someone else. So it's really important to just, keep talking and keep, getting everybody's experiences out there.
Yeah. Oh, I believe that. And, what I see it in myself. It's not as easy to notice the positives of CF, but there are plenty of counterbalance. But, the positives, and you see people with CF and you see the determination, pure determination in people to achieve or want to do things in defiance of having CF. And whatever level you operate at, you want to get a task finished or you want to do well in an exam, and you don't want to not do well in an exam because it's almost like you're giving in to CF or letting that disrupt your performance. So you do your best all the time. I see that in people. Obviously, there's individuals that maybe don't get that with CF, but I think a lot do. A lot, if they hadn't CF, they might be a bit more lackadaisical or a bit lazier about completing tasks or, the level of commitment they give to whatever it is they're doing, work, study, whatever. But I think people with CF, they give it that bit extra because they don't want to fail in a task and then say, well, I failed because of CF, because that's sort of almost giving in to having CF, to letting CF sort of win over a little battles in your day,
right,
or your life. You know what I mean? So you do it, you motivate yourself so much more to do something and do something well as best you can. So I think I see that in myself, and I know I see it in others with CF as well.
I really appreciate you sharing this story with us. You shared your CF Ireland story with us, and you shared this relationship story with us.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it because you've shed a really important light on so many things, life with CF in Ireland, the foundation that you volunteer for, your relationship. So thank you so much for
you're welcome.
Opening up about this and about, your marriage and, having your daughters.
Yes.
And how you got there. We talked about that in the previous podcast. So it's just wonderful to get to know you.
Yeah, well, maybe your listeners hearing this will see a lot of commonality in the story, but happy to share, it's a global voice.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Rory.
No problem. Okay, good talking to you.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen, who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know what's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, Visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Viatris, Genentech, and Vertex. It was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.